This episode of The Edge is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek.fm at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
You're listening to Trek FM.
What have you done out there on the edge of Federation space?
Welcome everyone to the first episode of Notes from the Edge, a sub-show of our Star Trek Discovery podcast, The Edge. I'm C Bryan Jones, or Chris, and I'll be your host as we flip through the pages of our notebook. In Notes from the Edge, we'll explore connections between Discovery and the greater Star Trek universe. And when I say greater, I mean not only the 6 TV series and the 13 films that have come before it, but also the massive literary universe, because there are elements from there that are being worked into the series. And as some of you listening to the network for a long time know, I started Literary Treks, which is our books and comics show, together with Matthew Rushing, and Matthew and I hosted that together for a couple of years before we gradually transitioned it over to Dan and Bruce, who are on there now. So I really like exploring those connections, and I hope you'll enjoy sort of the extra way the writers who are aware of the literary universe, which of course these writers are, especially Kirsten, are using that to flesh out Star Trek. I think it's kind of cool. In addition to this sub-show will also be my opportunity as the creator and publisher of Trek FM to share my thoughts on each episode of Discovery. As I live in Tokyo, it isn't practical for me to participate in the Edge itself in the main show, thanks to those lovely things we have called time zones, so I'm going to be doing it here. This is how the show is going to work. The first part will be my thoughts on the episode we all just watched, and then the second part will be a deep dive into connections. There were a lot of little gems in the Vulcan Hello and Battle at the Binary Stars, such as mentions of the planet Donatu 5 from The Trouble with Tribbles and TNG's Inheritance and DS9's Sons and Daughters. There was also the planet Hatoria, which is from All Good Things. Worf was the governor of Hatoria. They mention the Gamma Hydra system, which is from TOS's The Deadly Years, as well as the famous Kobayashi Maru simulation in The Wrath of Khan, and also the matron of Vulcan philosophy, T'Plana Hoth, from The Voyage Home, when Spock is retraining his mind, and also from Star Trek First Contact, that was the name of the ship that landed in Bozeman, Montana. And in Discovery, it's mentioned in the form of the USS T'Plana Hoth, which is one of the ships that warps in to help the Shenzhou. And of course, it wouldn't be Star Trek without this.
Captain, I'm detecting a voluntary antimatter containment breach on the Europa.
They're going to self-destruct.
Shields up to 47%.
So, there you go. They got it right there in the premiere. Despite having all these connections, and there are lots more that I jotted down, but some of them are obvious, some of them are niche, but they're very, there's not a lot of background information about them. I've decided, instead of doing a full rundown, that for this episode of Notes from the Edge, I'm going to focus on 2 connections: Klingon houses and the Black Fleet. These are the ones that I felt were the most interesting, especially the Black Fleet. Before getting to those, however, I'd like to share with you my basic thoughts on the first 2 episodes, and I'm going to approach this as just one story. I'll touch on 4 points: premise, film style, characters, and for characters I'm only going to talk about Georgiou, Saru, and Burnham, And then the fourth point is the Klingons. So first up, the premise. This has ruffled a lot of feathers among fans, which is to be expected when you decide to do stories prior to the original series or in the gaps that exist on the timeline. Surely some of you remember the lead up to Enterprise and even the years after it premiered. Creatives always want to make their creation their own, even when they are taking great steps to respect what has come before. So naturally, there are going to be differences and some things that don't fully connect. It's the nature of creativity. When you add to that the inevitable change in film style, because this is being made in 2017, the writers are walking a fine line, requiring a tough balancing act. And whether these differences bother you comes down to where you place importance when it comes to Star Trek. Do you care about technological continuity, uniform design, sound effects, or do you care more about the stories? There are no right or wrongs here. It's all up to you, but your priorities will affect how you receive any change. For me, personally, story comes above all else. Now, when I say all else, I don't mean absolutely everything else. If the writers and designers did something really crazy, like add a robot named Robbie to the bridge, something that breaks the wall between Star Trek and other shows or films or franchises, then that would be a problem. But tweaks to the creative to make the stories work for today's audience, particularly those not dyed in the Starfleet wool, that stuff doesn't bother me. At this point, I have faith that the writers will pull all the strings together. Maybe they'll miss a few. It's okay. I just think they're going to pull them together in a way that we don't expect. We're going to look back and say, wow, that was really cool. And why were we so upset? You know, there's so much in Star Trek that we accept as canon now that seemed to come out of nowhere the first time we saw it. It's an imaginary universe. As real as it seems and as real as we want it to be, it's an imaginary universe created by people, created by writers. And the characters, places, and events don't exist until someone writes them. And throughout Star Trek's history, writers have been going back and filling in the gaps. And we've come to accept these things. Personally, I'd rather have the timeline fleshed out because in the end, it makes the universe seem more real. So I'm fine with the premise, and I'm fine with it being set a year after The Cage and 10 years before the original series. We'll see how it all fits in, and if it doesn't fit perfectly, I mean, that's okay with me too. You know, I can dismiss something here and there as necessary to make the greater whole work together. I've been doing it my whole life with Star Trek, and I think I can keep doing it now, and I'm happy to do so. I'm just glad we have new Trek. Okay, let's go into the next point, film style. The visual differences between Discovery and the rest of Star Trek, and the similarities between this and the J.J. Abrams Kelvin timeline films has spawned all sorts of theories about this not really being the prime timeline. But the writers have made it clear that this is the prime timeline, and I think they know where they're setting their story. So if the writers tell me it's the prime timeline, it's the prime timeline. Now it's up to them to make it all work, and we need to give them time to do so. But I really don't get the conspiracy theories that I've been seeing out there about how somehow this is not prime timeline. You know, the writers say it is, and that's good enough for me, and maybe it's because I'm a creative professional myself. I'm accustomed to doing creative work and evolving things over time, and I'm comfortable with it. I don't really get caught up in trying to maintain creative purity over half a century. It's really not possible. I suppose it's possible, but would that be the best creative for today if we did that, if we were so rigid that we did not allow adaptation of the creative that's come before? Personally, I think we need to have that flexibility, so I'm fine with things evolving. As Mike Schindler pointed out on episode 12 of The Edge, which I joined him for, The visual style of the J.J. Abrams films is not really a Kelvin timeline style, even though that's what we like to call it as Star Trek fans. It's just filmmaking in the 2010s. Personally, I'm glad they are updating elements like control panels on the bridge to be touch panels instead of analog sliders and buttons. It makes the show more accessible to the general audience and also makes it more natural for us. We're so accustomed to these types of interfaces and technologies in our own lives that seeing them in Discovery creates a natural connection for us. We associate how the characters interact with and control the ship with how we would do it now, so we aren't taken out of the story. If all the controls were like those of the original series, while yes, that stuff seemed futuristic in 1966, it would be a disconnect for us now. Preparing for this episode to record this right now, I was doing some other research and I was going to get a sound clip, in fact. And I watched when they beam the torpedo to the Klingon corpse. And they're sliding up, and it's a transporter, it's a slider like you would have in past Star Trek, but it's not a physical button, it's like a touch panel. And the thing is that I've watched these episodes 4 times, and I didn't pay attention to any of that during those 4 times. And it was just here, because I went back and I was looking at a very specific moment, that I really noticed that. And that's what I mean by not being taken out of the story. They're interacting with these controls the same way I would interact with my iPhone or my iPad. And that makes it very real for me. Whereas if they had some big analog slider and they had jelly bean buttons around it, well, I'm fine with it because I grew up with the original series, but it just wouldn't seem as plausible for me today in 2017 that would be a natural evolution of where we are now. So that's what I'm getting at here. And that's not to say that it's wrong to want everything to be precisely in line with the original series. If that's really important to you, then I get that. And I can understand where, this doesn't feel like 10 years before the original series for you. And that's fine. But for me, again, I grew up with the original series. I was halfway through high school when The Next Generation premiered. I expect these elements to be updated to feel like a possible progression of our present-day technology. I personally would be disappointed if they didn't update it. All right, that's film style. Next, let's talk about characters. I'm going to focus on just 3, and the first is Captain Georgiou. I really liked this character. I really liked Michelle Yeoh's portrayal. I thought she was great, very natural feeling. Of course, some of the dialogue felt a bit stiff, which is almost always the case with the TV show pilot, because the actors don't really know their characters yet. It's not like watching a 4th or 5th season episode of a TV series. So I expect that a little bit, but I think for the most part, she was great. She came across as experienced, wise, nurturing, caring but firm, all the qualities I would expect from a Starfleet captain. I hated to see her die so soon, although I kind of expected it, because they set her name apart from the others in the opening credits as special guest star. So I thought, okay, well, she's just here for these first episodes and then she's going to be gone. But I think there is a good chance that we'll be seeing her again in flashbacks, since she was so critical to Burnham's development. So we'll see. Maybe we haven't seen the last of Michelle Yeoh. I certainly hope not. Now, this brings me to Burnham, the star of the show, and no, it doesn't bother me to find out that Spock has an adopted sister who's human. Mike and I talked about this on The Edge, episode 12. We didn't know about Sybok until Star Trek V. In the original series, we didn't know Spock's dad was the Vulcan ambassador to Earth until Journey to Babel. We didn't know Spock had a wife until Amok Time. Spock just doesn't like to tell us things. And so this doesn't surprise me at all. It doesn't bother me. It's fine to fill in the gaps. And actually, it isn't clear from the first 2 episodes that she is Spock's adopted sister. Although I did hear Sonequa Martin Green say this in an interview when asked. But is she truly Spock's adopted sister? we don't know. From what we've seen so far, we just know that Sarek took her in and guided her after the Klingon attack. He refers to her as my charge. He doesn't say this is my daughter, this is my adopted daughter, or anything along those lines. And, their discussion, when they have the holographic projection discussion, it feels a bit more like a mentor-pupil relationship rather than a father-daughter relationship, or even, a stepfather and adoptive father. I do get the impression, though, that Sarek is like an adoptive father to her, even if she isn't officially part of his family. So we'll see. And for all we know, maybe we'll find out that, yes, he did adopt her. And if that's in David Mack's book, I haven't read it yet, and we'll see. So maybe it's already out there. But going by what we've seen on screen, it's not completely clear yet. As for the portrayal, I think Sonequa Martin Green is doing a good job of balancing the Vulcan and human. It's really an interesting concept. Well, it's always interesting to watch how actors approach playing a Vulcan. And I think what they're doing with the character of Michael Burnham in Discovery is really interesting, because we've seen the half Vulcan, half human Spock. And of course, we've seen that character shift completely to being Vulcan and then shift back. Then on Voyager, we've seen the full Vulcan Tuvok. On Enterprise, we've had the full Vulcan T'Pol, who becomes heavily influenced by human culture. And now we get the full human, who was raised on Vulcan, who is heavily influenced by Vulcan culture. So it's like a fourth direction from which to approach the concept of the battle between emotion and logic. And what I've seen from Sonequa so far shows that she has a really good handle on how to play the logic and play the emotion, and you could kind of see that tug-of-war in her, and I think she'll get much better at it as the episodes go by and she gets comfortable with the character. So I like it so far. The other character I'll mention is Saru, or as I call him, Lieutenant Sheldon. I really like this character, and I really like Doug Jones's portrayal, but Saru is Sheldon Cooper on the bridge of a starship. Just watch. If you didn't get that impression the first time you watched, or the second or the third, or however many times you have fired up CBS All Access or Netflix, just watch it, especially in the Vulcan Hello. Everything from his reaction of, really? When Georgiou tells him that Burnham agrees with his assessment of the object, that there's something out there. Or his expression when Burnham pushes him aside when scanning the object. And watch his protective nature of his workstation, and how he brushes Burnham aside and says, as science officer, I can provide a far more concrete and in-depth analysis than simply reading data off a monitor. So that part is very Sheldon, and then it gets even more so. He says, but considering it's scrambling our optical processors, how are we going to be able to see it? Totally Sheldon. But I like Saru. And the makeup is really well done as well. That's one thing about the makeup. I mean, Star Trek has always had wonderful, wonderful makeup, and the makeup artists, and Michael Westmore is fantastic, but the resolution at which they are shooting this show and the resolution of our televisions today are such that they have to be just absolutely perfect, or you will see every little imperfection and every little blemish, and maybe it doesn't look quite real enough. And I think they did a really nice job with Saru. So, last point for my impressions is the Klingons. Has anything caused more controversy than the redesign of the Klingons? They're actually not that far off from what we're used to. If you put some hair on them, there would be far less controversy. And as I said on The Edge 12, I would not have redesigned them myself unless it was necessary for the story. I think you could have taken the Klingons from TNG onward and used them in Discovery, I think they would have been perfectly fine. So the question is this redesign necessary for the story? We don't know yet. There is the possibility, especially considering that T'Kuvma's ship is ancient, and those he has gathered seem to be a cult of sorts, that what we've seen so far are Klingons from a different part of the homeworld, or even a different part of the Empire at large. This has been suggested even by the writers I have heard, but we don't really know yet. Larry Nemechek and I also talked about this way back on the Ready Room, speculating that, well, maybe these are different Klingons. And I'll talk more about that in the notes. One other thing about the Klingons that T'Kuvma has gathered is really interesting, and I don't know for sure if this is a connection, but Volk, the Klingon with the very pale skin, the albino, essentially he's the albino. Now, is he the albino from Deep Space Nine's Blood Oath? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe he's the same family. Maybe, well, it says he's an outsider, so he's not from a great house, but, we don't know. Maybe there are lots of Klingons that have really pale, whitish skin. Perhaps we'll find that out in this series. But if this is a connection, and seeing what these writers are doing, it very well may be. If this is a callback to the albino in Blood Oath, I think it's really, really clever. Because in Blood Oath, when you see the albino, it's never really clear if he's a Klingon. He could be another alien that just looks very similar to a Klingon because he doesn't look like the rest of the Klingons, right? But maybe he is a Klingon, and maybe Volk could be him. Klingons are very long-lived, so it's possible that Volk is the albino in Blood Oath, or maybe it's his son who we meet. Who knows? I think it's really interesting, though. All right, so what else do I have to say about Klingons? I'm really interested to see where they go with all of this. I find the Klingons, they're, along with the Vulcans, one of the best-known races in Star Trek. But like Vulcans, they're, for me, one of the less interesting races in Star Trek because there has been such little development. We rarely see any Klingon who isn't from the warrior class, even though a society could not function without scientists, doctors, engineers, chefs, lawyers, and real estate agents. So we know that diversity is there. It has to be there in the culture, and we have seen a few glimpses of it, but very few. I always compare the Klingons to the Cardassians. The Klingons have been in Star Trek from the beginning, all the way through the franchise. The Cardassians were introduced on The Next Generation and then played a key role in Deep Space Nine. But on Deep Space Nine, they fleshed out the Cardassian culture to a much greater extent than the Klingons have ever been fleshed out. So if Discovery is up to the challenge of fleshing out the Klingons the way Enterprise took up the challenge of fleshing out the Vulcans, I think it's wonderful. And I'm excited to see what they do with it. In terms of appearance, any planet is likely to have a wide range of appearances within a single species. When you think about the factors of geography and climate, the things that play into those variations in the way we look. We're all humans, right? But we look quite different, and I think that is going to be true on pretty much any planet. So it isn't very realistic to assume that all Klingons must look exactly like Worf, Gowron, and Martok. So if you see Star Trek as a real universe, which I feel most of us do as fans, I think that's one reason that we're drawn to it and we stick with it decade after decade after decade. If you see it that way, this tendency that we have as fans to cling on to the idea that everyone from a certain alien race has to look the same, it really doesn't make any sense. It's not realistic. What they're doing right now is realistic. Of course, the catch is they have to connect it to Klingons we've already seen in the original series and in the Next Generation onward. Will they do that? We don't know yet. We'll find out. I certainly hope they do, because if they do, then this will make so much sense, and it really will make the Klingons feel like a more realistic race. Bottom line for me with the Klingons is that this is another area of creative license that doesn't bother me. But I completely understand why it does bother many fans on a surface level. I just think we need to dig deeper as fans if we really think Star Trek represents a real universe. All right, so those are my basic thoughts on the first 2 episodes. I've watched them, as I mentioned, 4 times each, and I really like what they're doing with the series so far. So let's move on into the second part of Notes from the Edge and open our notebook.
Tavish, Erde, Bachgrub, Tachavish, Egdish, Shuwi, Uchemo, Shucher, Shegmaj, Me, Yinomoch, it's Sutov Vokoda, Lashmo, Inchu, Maber.
That's T'Kuvma speaking as he recovers the fallen Klingon warriors in Battle at the Binary Stars. He is saying, a warrior who dies in his sleep is no more than flesh and bone. A warrior who perishes honorably in battle is blessed. A hero's demise brings pride for a life given in defense of our race, and comfort in the knowledge that new life awaits in Stovokor. Join your vaunted comrades, brothers and sisters, for you are not alone, and stand watch among the Black Fleet forever. The Black Fleet? You may have asked yourself when watching the Discovery premiere, what's the Black Fleet? Where did that come from? We've never seen the Klingons talk about the Black Fleet before. There go the writers making up more Klingon stuff, and this is just proof that they're just completely redoing the Klingons and they're throwing canon out the window. Well, actually, the Klingon Black Fleet goes back to the early 1980s. And this is where I mentioned we're going to make connections into the literary universe. But not only the literary universe. There is a bit of an on-screen connection to some of this as well. So the Black Fleet is a term for the Klingon afterlife, which we know as Stovokor, and T'Kuvma mentions in his bit here, Stovokor. He talks about Stovokor and the Black Fleet. This term was first used in John M. Ford's novel The Final Reflection, which was published in 1984 by Pocket Books. And this is quite a famous novel for those who are into Klingons, because Ford's take on the Klingons, as seen in this novel, was also the basis for their portrayal in the FASA role-playing game. The first edition of the FASA role-playing game was published in 1982, and a second edition in 1983, and FASA continued releasing game material through 1989, and they worked in material from Ford's take on the Klingons. The concept was picked up again in the literary universe in the 1990 Next Generation novel Metamorphosis, written by Jean Laura. In this story, it is explained to Data by a Theskian named Thrallin that Worf and other Klingons believed that they would go to serve in the Black Fleet upon their deaths. Then, with the release of the computer game Star Trek Klingon in 1996, the concept was worked into a chant called the Warrior's Anthem. And this is where we get our on-screen connection, because the Warrior's Anthem was sung in Klingon in the Deep Space Nine episode Soldiers of the Empire, right near the end, right before Jadzia drags Worf off to the infirmary. And let me play a clip of that for you now, see if you recognize this.
Tactical alert! Tactical alert! There is a Jem'Hadar warship bearing 180 Mark 215. They will be within weapons range in 9 minutes.
The Jem'Hadar will soon learn to regret this day. Who is with me?
Koi, Keles, Claude.
Koi, Pukme, Poo. Yakbo, Makbo, Teshui. Sema, Shumeu. Marcha! Shumana, Emakam, Shum. The day is a Matak War. Cool. Bakma, Shepes, Ejo, Kishtak, Bak, Madi, Marek, Mashutak, Maber, Mashutak, Mao. Yakbo, Makbo, Teshui. Sema, Shumeu.
So what are they chanting here? So if we translate this into English, they're saying, "Hear, sons of Kales, hear, daughters too. The blood of battle washes clean, the warrior brave and true. We fight, we love, and then we kill. Our lives burn short and bright. Then we die with honor and join our fathers in the Black Fleet, where we battle forever, battling on through the eternal fight." So this chant then made its way into the literary universe in the DS9 novel Inferno. And this is a book by Judith and Garfield Reeves-Stevens, two of the all-time great Star Trek novelists, of course, a writing duo, husband and wife. And Inferno is book 3 of 3 in the Millennium Trilogy, which you can actually get now as an omnibus, which is nice. Get all 3 books together. And it's also in the TNG novel Diplomatic Implausibility by our friend Keith DeCandido, and that was published in 2001. Now, if we fast forward to 2010, Keith wrote a novella in a collection called 7 Deadly Sins, and the novella is called The Unhappy Ones. In this story, Malvak, son of Jork, performs the Klingon death ritual for his friend Krov. And he performs the ritual to signal the Black Fleet of Krov's impending arrival, so to let the Black Fleet know that Krov is coming. And this is kind of what T'Kuvma does, right, in Battle at the Binary Stars, when he's sending the warriors that he's collected out onto the ship. And this all took place in 2269. So this is the story in The Unhappy Ones. It's set in 2269. The Vulcan Hello and Battle at the Binary Stars take place in 2256. So what we saw in Discovery is just 13 years earlier than what we see in Keith's novella. So you can imagine that this practice by the Klingons could still be going. And although we have seen Klingons show little interest in preserving the bodies of their dead, there is a reference in Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home that supports the idea that at least some Klingons do have such practices. Tell me if you recognize this.
White queen to section 5, grid 6. Queen takes knight, rook takes queen. White pawn to section 5, grid 7. Pawn takes rook. Checkmate. What significant contribution to bioengineering was made in Lucarian outposts on Clyde?
The Universal Atmospheric Element Compensator.
Evaluate and conclude. A starship sensor is indicated as being pursued so closely that it occupies the same space as its pursuer. Correct. Identify object and its cultural significance.
Klingon mummification glyph.
If that's where the Discovery writers got the idea for T'Kuvma's practice of mummifying fallen warriors, I think it's a really clever little connection from a fleeting on-screen moment from 1986. So, before we leave this topic, let's look at some specific excerpts from the stories that I mentioned. First, let's go back to Ford's novel, The Final Reflection. Here are a few excerpts that relate to the Black Fleet. In Chapter 2, Vryn, who is a Klingon orphan who's central to the story, is talking to an alien named Tyrion. And Tyrion is a servitor. It's kind of like a slave, but he says he willfully serves the Klingons. And what he's doing at this point in the story is he's transporting in a Klingon admiral. He beams in this admiral, and the admiral says, "The war continues on every space of the board." He nodded to Vryn and went out of the transporter pavilion toward the house. Tyrion began locking up the console. Vryn thought of what he had wanted to ask the servitor for a long time now. Suddenly, perhaps because of the quiet of the mood, or their distance from the life of the house, it seemed the right time to ask. "Tyrion, do you believe in the Black Fleet?" "My people mostly believe in a next life," Tyrion said, without looking from his work, "though there are no starships in it. But we evolved separately, and if one world's idea is true, I suppose all must be." It was much more answer than Vryn had expected, but he took it as affirmation. "When my father has gone to command there, will you then be his transporteer?" "What?" Tyrion said quietly. "Does the Empire's hold extend so far as that?" "Any race may reach. I know. Kethos has told me I will have a place on his black ship, even if I do not want it." And then later in the story, in chapter 6, Vryn, who at this point is called Kryn, his name changes over the course of the story, he's playing a game of chess against a Vulcan child at a diplomatic conference in Atlanta, of all places. 2 Klingons have come to Earth and they're going to Atlanta. They're setting up like a Klingon embassy. And he's playing chess with this Vulcan child and he's losing. And the child says, "Given the established balance of our skills, Captain, and other factors being equal, you cannot defeat me with the odds of a rook. It would be logical for you to resign." "Klingons do not resign," Kryn said. 7 or 8 years old, Akil had said. Kryn had killed his first intelligent being when he was this one's age. A human starship crewman, a prize in the year games. The sequence of moves is predictable, and barring suboptimal strategies, inevitable. The time consumed. If I go to the Black Fleet, what matter that I go a little slowly? Kryn thought of the human who had shouted challenge into Kryn's face even as he died. It was an honorable death and a glorious kill. "What is the Black Fleet?" the Vulcan asked. Kryn pulled back from his memory. "One who serves his ship well in the life we see will serve on a ship of the fleet when this life ends." There are other references to the Black Fleet in the book, quite a few of them actually, but these 2 I felt are the ones that explain the most about the idea. So let's jump ahead now. Metamorphosis, the novel from the Next Generation, is actually called, I think, the first giant novel for TNG. The reference that I mentioned a moment ago in Metamorphosis comes when the Theskian sociologist Thraylin is talking to Data about how wars have long been fought over religion and spiritual differences. And of course it ties into the story, but he's talking about what he has come to believe. And recounting his encounter with godlike aliens, he tells Data, "Those were not gods as I believe in a god," Thraylin replied. "One day we will understand the kinds of powers those Elysian gods possess. But beyond us, beyond them, beyond anything the sentient mind can comprehend, there is a force that drives the universe. While we are alive, we can only understand it in some familiar form, such as the Great Mother. But when we leave this state of existence, we will experience that force directly. I will go to the arms of the Great Mother. Mr. Worf would say that he will enter the Black Fleet. We both mean the same thing." "But you believe in an existence after death. You believe you have a soul?" Data asked. "Oh yes, there is no doubt of it." And then The Unhappy Ones, Keith DeCandido's novella. Beyond just mentioning the Black Fleet, this ties into the whole question about the different kinds of Klingons a bit. So in the story, Malvac discovers the body of his missing friend, Krove. Krove and Malvac are Kucha Klingons. Kucha can be translated as Unhappy One, which is the title of the novella. And this refers to a Klingon infected with the virus called Kuvat that resulted in the loss of forehead ridges. Reading from the story, soon Malvak found Krove's body wedged behind a support beam and a cave wall, his dead eyes staring straight ahead. A blade of some sort had ripped open his throat. Immediately, Malvak pried his friend's eyes open wider and screamed to the heavens. That scream was interrupted by his section chief, Kao. "What in the name of Kalas's hand are you doing, Malvak?" Standing aside, Malvak revealed the corpse of Krove. "Someone has killed Krove. I was merely warning the Black Fleet." "Of what?" Kao asked derisively, staring at Malvak with beady little eyes under deep ridges. "Now I've seen everything. A useless mine worker is commending the soul of another useless mine worker to Stovokor as if he were a Klingon." Kao was a Himkuch Klingon, or one with forehead ridges, which you probably gathered from the description there. And in the screaming, of course, we've seen Worf do that on The Next Generation with other Klingons, and we also see the Klingons in Discovery do this as well. So it's really interesting how they're combining that aspect that we know of the Klingons screaming as they look up when one of their comrades has been killed with the concept of mummification, which we haven't seen before, but of course we do have that reference in The Voyage Home that suggests that, yes, there is a Klingon practice of mummification. And then they're pulling together the Black Fleet, and they're just combining all these things, and I find it very interesting. So we talked right there about forehead ridges and no forehead ridges, and this seems like a good transition point to the other connection that I'd like to explore, and those are the Klingon houses. We learn in Discovery that there are 24 great houses that make up the Klingon High Council. Now, as a Star Trek fan, if you don't think about it at all, you might think that, oh yeah, there are 24 houses. Of course, there are 24 houses. Surely we've been told that somewhere along the way. Well, actually, no, we haven't. We've seen far fewer, which I'll list out here shortly. So we don't know what they're going to do with the Klingons because they have a lot of room to work here based on what we've seen. I did see some comments from some fans who claim that the writers lied to us, like blatantly lied to everyone before the premiere in an effort to stop all the controversy about the redesign of the Klingons. The claim is that because none of the Klingons that we see projecting themselves onto T'Kuvma's bridge look like the Klingons from the original series or The Next Generation onward, and therefore it was all a big lie. All the Klingons in Discovery look just like T'Kuvma and the Klingons on his ship and the ones that we saw beam in. But the thing is, we only saw Klingons from 7 of the 24 great houses in Battle at the Binary Stars. Yes, 24 ships arrived when T'Kuvma lit the beacon, but 24 leaders did not project themselves onto T'Kuvma's bridge in the scene in which we see him stating his case for reunification. Only 7 did, and one of them gets annoyed and goes away, and then we're left with only 6. So that means there are 17 that we didn't see. How do we know that some of those don't look like the Klingons of TNG DS9 and Voyager? How do we know that some of them aren't Kuch-Ha Klingons from TOS and Enterprise without forehead ridges? We don't know. Maybe they aren't. Maybe every Klingon in Discovery looks like what we've seen so far. But we have no idea because there are 17 houses that arrived and we haven't seen anyone from any of those 17 houses yet. So let's let the story unfold and see where it goes. As for the houses themselves and the count of 24, how many houses have been mentioned in past Star Trek? If we include the literary universe, the number is 56. though not all of those are great houses. If we stick only with the screen, we've heard of just 11. So, what are those 11? There's the House of Antak from Enterprise's Divergence. Antak was the Klingon doctor who was disowned by his father for wanting to practice medicine, which is kind of interesting, right? Because I talked earlier about how we only see the warrior race. So maybe there's an inclination, at least within certain Klingon families, that you would be a warrior. And if you want to do something besides being a warrior, then your family doesn't want you anymore. So that's what happened to Antak anyway. And Phlox assisted him with finding a cure to the mutagenic virus, which causes the augment virus, which causes Klingons to lose their forehead ridges. So that's one. Number two, this one we all know quite well, the House of Duras. We see the House of Duras in Enterprise's Judgment, The Expanse, The Next Generation's Sins of the Father, Reunion, Redemption, Firstborn, and the movie Generations. Also, Deep Space Nine's Past Prologue, The Way of the Warrior, and The Sword of Kahless. And, of course, Lursa and B'Etor are part of the House of Duras. Of course, there's Duras himself. They're one of the most famous families, let's say, in Star Trek. So that's two. Number three, House of Dagor. This is from the House of Quark, the Deep Space Nine episode. The House of Dagor was an enemy of the House of Kozak, and it suffered humiliation in 2371 when the dishonorable actions of the house's head, Dagor, led to his discommendation. In Discovery in 2256, the time of battle at the binary stars, Dennis is the leader of this house, and we see him holographically projected onto the screen. Okay, number four, House of Kor, from Deep Space Nine's Once More Unto the Breach. Now, of course, we know Kor from Errand of Mercy. We see Kor himself, and we also see him again in Blood Oath, and his house, the House of Kor, is one of the great houses. Number five, and I'm not doing a top 10 list here, or top 11 list or anything, I'm just numbering them. Number five, House of Mokai. The House of Mokai is mentioned in Voyager's The Killing Game, when Janeway is a Klingon and fighting the Hirogen in that episode. She is a member of the House of Mokai. In 2256 in Discovery, Ujili is the leader of this house, and we see Ujili on the bridge of Takuvma's ship. The sixth house is the House of Grilka, from DS9's The House of Quark, and looking for Parmach in all the wrong places. This was formerly the House of Kozak, and it was temporarily the House of Quark, in a sort of amusing little twist in that episode. Kozak was killed in an accident in Quark's bar. There was no male heir, so that created the situation where the Klingons were forced to face the exploration of gender lines in succession, which is an interesting topic to me, living in Japan, because we have that issue right now. Our emperor wants to abdicate, and that's going to happen, but the line is, it's a long story, but women are not allowed to become empress in Japan. And so seeing this in Star Trek was kind of interesting, because this is still an issue here on Earth even today. So anyway, House of Grilka, in the end, the High Council had to make a special exception, and they allowed Grilka to lead her house, and therefore we now have the House of Grilka as one of the great houses. There's the House of Konja from Deep Space Nine's Apocalypse Rising. This is the episode where they go to expose Galron as a changeling. They believe that the founders have infiltrated the Klingon Empire. Miles took on the persona of Pahash, and Pahash is a member of the House of Konja. So that's where this one comes from. Then we have the House of Korath, and this is from Voyager's Endgame. Korath is the Klingon with whom Janeway negotiates to get the chronodeflector so she can change the outcome of Voyager's journey. Next up is House of Martok. I think we all know this one, and if you don't, please go watch Deep Space Nine. And then we have the House of Mogh. I think we all know this one as well, and if you don't, pour yourself a glass of prune juice and go soak in a mud bath with Lwaxana, and you'll hear all about it from Alexander. And lastly, we have the House of Nogra, and this is from Deep Space Nine's Sons of Mogh. This is the house that took in Worf's brother Kurn after he killed another Klingon warrior, and of course the House of Mogh was being dissolved, and rather than allowing Kurn to kill himself, they came up with a plan to give him a new life, so he had his DNA and his memory altered, and he thought now that he was a man named Rodek, and the House of Nogra took him in. So that's where we are. So let's run down those houses one more time. 1, House of Antak. 2, House of Duras. 3, House of Dagor. 4, House of Kor. 5, House of Mokai. 6, House of Groka. 7, House of Konja. 8, House of Korath. 9, House of Martok. 10, House of Mogh. 11, House of Nogra. So those are the 11 houses that we've seen on screen. So when Discovery has 24 houses to work with, and the House of Takuvma is not a great house, so forget about those Klingons and the albino, we've only seen leaders of 7 of the 24 houses on Discovery. And we've only ever heard on screen of 11 houses, 11 great houses. So let's just wait and see where the writers are going with this, because it could be really, really interesting. So there you go. An all Klingon episode of Notes from the Edge for week 1 of Star Trek Discovery. I hope you found it interesting. And be sure to check out our Discovery coverage throughout the week. After the episode airs on Sunday night in the US, we're going to have a live show on Monday night where Bruce and Brandy watch and react. So you get those first impressions just right after seeing the episode. And that's broadcast live on YouTube on Monday nights. It's 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. So you can watch live, but we also put it in the podcast feed on Tuesday morning as a regular podcast episode. And that show is called Live from the Edge. Then on Wednesdays, we have a commentary track for you. Mike and Max, the great duo that you've known for years from Commentary Track Stars and Commentary Trek Stars here on Trek FM, they got back together to bring us commentaries for Discovery, which is really cool. And those are going to be out on Wednesdays. So I think it's probably the quickest turnaround ever for you to get a commentary track to a TV episode. On Thursdays, we'll discuss your feedback on Postcards from the Edge with Amy Nelson. And of course, you can catch full analysis on the Edge main show, our usual Trek FM style. That's on Fridays. And then I'll be wrapping things up each week here on Notes from the Edge on Saturdays with this kind of deep dive into links between Discovery and the broader franchise. On the main show, we have 4 main hosts on there. We've got Aaron Harvey, Brandon Shea Mutala, Mike Schindler, and Amy Nelson. We also have guests on from time to time, and people are in different combinations. One of the unique things we're doing here with The Edge compared with our other shows on the network is we're just trying to mix up the voices all the time. So I hope you like hearing all the different viewpoints. And you'll find all of these shows in the main feed for The Edge and in the Trek FM master feed. And just one quick note about the way we're numbering these. The main show is numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, just like our other shows. But when you see these odd combinations of letters and numbers, those represent the first letter of the name of the sub-shows. So when you see L1, L2, L3, that's the live show. T1, T2, T3, that's tracks from The Edge, the commentaries. P1, P2, P3 is the mailbag show postcards. And then my show here, Notes, is N1, N2, N3. So when you see those, that's just what it means. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode of Notes from the Edge, hear what you think about the Klingons, some of the background that I provided, and of course we'd love to hear your thoughts on Discovery in general. The best place to do that is in the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook, where Amy Nelson will collect your feedback for postcards from the Edge, our Thursday show, and she might just read your feedback right there on the air. You can also find us on Twitter. Our username is TrekFM, or send us email using the contact form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Just choose to send to a show and choose the Edge, and that'll go out to all the different hosts. If you'd like to reach me personally, of course you can find me there in the Babel Conference, which I mentioned during the show, but you can also find me on Twitter, where my username is C Bryan Jones. That's the letter C and Bryan with a Y. That's my name pretty much everywhere in social media. And you can find me talking Star Trek elsewhere on the network. On two shows, there's my main show, The Ready Room. That's the one I mentioned earlier in this episode when I said that Larry Nemeczek and I had been talking about Discovery, speculating on the Klingons, and so forth. That show covers all 5 live-action Star Trek series, and, well, now 6 with Discovery, and all the movies. And that's been going since 2011, so there are, I think, about 215 episodes of that, if you'd like to hear me talking Trek there. Larry and I are going to do an episode of The Ready Room coming up soon, where we talk about Discovery now that it's launched, because there are maybe 3 or 4 episodes with Larry and me talking about it prior to launch. Finally, we're going to be able to talk about our actual impressions. So stay tuned for that as soon as Larry and I are able to get together, given our various schedules, which can be challenging. The other show I do here on the network is our dedicated Deep Space Nine show, which is called The Orb. I co-host that with Matthew Rushing. We have a wonderful time talking about the wonderful series DS9. So if you're a Niner, be sure to check out The Orb. I'd also like to take a moment and thank our associate producers, Norman C. Lau, Tony Robinson, Lisa Slack, Tom Puleo, and Shoaib Mirza. Thank you so much, guys, for your support. I really appreciate it. You're doing so much to help us keep not only the Edge going, but the whole network. So thank you so much on behalf of all the hosts and all the listeners. If you'd like to help us keep all of our shows going and even become an associate producer yourself, visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM for all the details and all the perks, and we'd love to have you there. Well, that's all I have for you this time. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and join me again next time as we jot down more notes right on the paper's edge.